We are back, and we are joined now by Mier, pundit for Portuguese-language news portal Brasil 247, TeleSur correspondent, and author of the Delinking Brazil newsletter on Substack. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's good to see you again, and some good news at the very least. You guys down in Brazil know how to handle your right-wing coup attempts. Not so much here in the United States. Could you give folks just an update on the events of the past week and the charges brought against former President Jair Bolsonaro and others?
Okay, I don't want to get too excited yet because he's not in jail yet, so
true.
It's easy to say this before a guy goes to jail, but it's looking like the chances are very good right now. Basically, there was a congressional investigation that produced like 3,000 pages of evidence of Bolsonaro and 32 close allies, like systematically working towards a coup over a 2-year period, that involved all of this delegitimization of the electoral process. It's a plot to kill Lula, Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and vice presidential candidate Geraldo Alckmin before Lula could take power. That was then sent to the federal police. They slimmed it down to like an 878-page indictment and passed it on to the Attorney General's office. So yesterday, the Attorney General formally charged Bolsonaro and these 32 hench people of his. And they're handing it to the Supreme Court, who have to make the decision if they're going to accept it and set trial dates or not. Everybody is almost entirely certain that they will accept it and set the trial dates. I mean, it helps guarantee that the trial will be set, that part of the coup plot involved assassinating one of the Supreme Court ministers. So I can't see anyone really voting against it. So that's predicted for like next month. Then the trial process will start and he'll have a right to appeal. But if it all goes according to the way I think it will, he should be in jail by the end of the year.
Knock on wood. Yeah. But I guess let's go back to his presidency and the imprisonment of Lula to begin with, which he used false corruption charges to imprison the left-wing president of Brazil, his political opponent. And this was uncovered through a lot of different reporting, Operation Car Wash, etc. For folks that may not be familiar, can you give people some background about what Bolsonaro engaged in?
Well, this is important because Bolsonaro is now trying to make a false equivalency and say that he's a victim of lawfare, which is what happened to Lula. Bolsonaro wasn't directly involved in Lula's imprisonment. That was a process that was launched through a partnership with the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, and a group of public prosecutors in Curitiba, using the now temporarily banned FCPA Act as an excuse for U.S. involvement. Lula was charged and convicted based on entirely one coerced plea bargain testimony that was annulled later. The Supreme Court made an exception to the Constitution to allow him to be imprisoned during an election year before his appeals process played out. So although Bolsonaro wasn't exactly directly involved, he was the direct beneficiary, because when Lula was imprisoned, he was 20 points up in the polls, and Bolsonaro was the second most popular candidate. So he was like the beneficiary. But it would be, comparing the two cases as Bolsonaro does now, it's a major false equivalency, because they found, these guys did some really stupid things, like Bolsonaro's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Mauro Cid, erased all of the incrementing emails that had been exchanged in this 2-year-long coup plot, but he forgot to empty his trash folder. So when the police raided his house, they found all the emails, Wow. And then this General Augusto Heleno, who was Bolsonaro's intel chief and also the leader of MINUSTAH's armed forces during the 2005 Cite Soleil massacre in Haiti, someone who's just got this long history of rottenness, he kept meticulous handwritten notes in paper notebooks and left them like lying around his house. And so when the police raided his house, they found all these notebooks in which he's like planning out different crimes, not to mention all these tape-recorded meetings, and most ridiculously, many of the crimes, much of the evidence that's being used in this indictment, Bolsonaro did on live national TV and on live podcasts, YouTube, Facebook. Like he committed crimes on TV to audiences, numbering in hundreds of thousands. So it's very hard. It's going to be very hard for him to prove that he's innocent, and he's even admitting it. He's saying, "Oh yeah, well of course we planned a coup, but that was just talk. We were just joking around, locker room banter, But the problem is, as the indictment says, obviously it's a crime to plan a coup, right? Because if you're successful, you're never going to be arrested for it. I mean, it even says this in the indictment. So the only people who ever get arrested related to coups are people who don't pull them off. Every arrest that's ever happened for plotting a coup in Brazil has been people who failed at it.
I mean, that's an argument that you hear from conservatives here in the United States is like, Donald Trump couldn't have tried to overturn the results of the election. Biden's in office. He wasn't successful. It's like, wait, no, you can still try to rob a bank and not get away with it and still be tried for robbing a bank. But Brian, can you expand on the CIA involvement part? Because that's probably... go ahead.
Well, okay, I don't know if you've read Philip Agy's CIA Diaries.
I have not.
Old classic. Book. Okay, yeah, it's a classic. There's this rivalry within the CIA over Latin America. The FBI was operated in Latin America before the CIA even existed. And so when the CIA was formed, they just turned the FBI in Latin America into a division of the CIA, which was always like poo-pooed and looked down on by the other members of the CIA, because FBI, it's a long story, but anyway, FBI has always been very active in Latin America, despite the fact that the CIA took over a bunch of their operations. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, this is an example of like the Trump administration doing something for the wrong reasons, that's having a good effect on Latin America. FCPA is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It was signed off in this big treaty with the OECD in 1998, and all of the signatories basically open sovereignty of their countries to U.S.-led anti-corruption investigations. This is what led the FBI to arrest a bunch of FIFA officials in the World Cup headquarters in Switzerland 10 years ago. And this was their justification for getting involved in corruption investigations into Brazilian companies that were competing with American companies, mainly in the areas of petroleum and civil engineering. And so they launched this case against Odebrecht, arrested all of these businessmen, and then under the tutelage of a group of 16 FBI agents led by Leslie Bakshi's, for several years, they coached the task force in Brazil on how to leak information to the media, how to strategize to arrest top politicians, mainly focusing on PT and Lula. So I co-wrote an academic article about this that was published in Latin America Perspectives, UCLA's Latin America Quarterly, called The Long Coup. Look it up. It's too complicated to explain.
It's a good primer, though, Brian. I mean, because I don't think a lot of Americans have that understanding about the level of involvement to this day. And with Trump 1.0 in the first term, this is when this occurred.
Greenwald never talks about it, right?
Yes.
Greenwald never talks about the U.S. involvement in Operation Car Wash because it spanned the Democrats and the Republican administration.
Yeah.
You would think he would. Well, you wouldn't think anything about him anymore. But you would think he would care about U.S. involvement in a coup or something.
You would think, but I think he's kind of bumped up at the end of really what the whole Democrats are the national security state actors that we can only criticize thing because of this obvious. As you say, obvious interference by the Trump administration at the time. But the reality is this is bipartisan, which is a much more straightforward way to describe this. But so the timeline is Lula is imprisoned. Then Lula is freed. Lula gets out, defeats Bolsonaro, and then how did this coup attempt and plot get into the wheels start getting into motion?
It started as soon as he got out of prison, 2021. Okay, at that point, Bolsonaro and a bunch of strategists, including the grandson of dictator Figueiredo, the last president in the military dictatorship, who the New York Times calls a right-wing pundit, they planned to delegitimize the electoral system by attacking the electronic voting system. So starting in 2021, they started producing all of this information and feeding it to social media influencers, orchestrated by the grandson of former dictator, who's like a YouTuber. And Bolsonaro made a series of more and more aggressive attacks against the electronic voting system, even including a conspiracy theory that the only reason the 2018 elections made it to the second round was because the electronic voting system had been hacked and defrauded, to favor the communists. But then the question was like, it even says this in the indictment, what was their reason for the communists not winning the election then? Why did they go through all this effort just to take it to a second round and then let Bolsonaro win the election? And even the military itself produced a report saying there's no way to hack the electronic voting system. So this just got more and more aggressive to the point where he invited like 100 foreign ambassadors and diplomats to the presidential palace about a month and a half before the 2022 elections, in which he just railed against electronic voting, the electronic voting machines, without providing any evidence, and had it transmitted on national public television. That's the reason that he was convicted by the electoral courts of abuse of power, using a public asset and abusing your power as president to promote your own election campaign. And so they planned that, and then they set up preemptively the Stop the Steal narrative, which everyone knows. That Trump did it, Javier Milei set one up in case he didn't win the election in Argentina. All the right-wing, leaders connected to this international right-wing network are using the same kind of tactic on this. But when that, so when he lost, and then on election day, and this also comes out in the indictment, they had researched all of the voting districts that had the highest percentage of support for Lula, and they deployed the federal highway police out to those districts to do like a Jeb Bush 2000 strategy when they prevented black people from making it to the polling stations. They did this with people in the northeast of Brazil, which is the poorest part of Brazil, where most people voted for Lula. So
more indigenous, or
just mixed, indigenous, black, and white all mixed together, basically. Just poor because it's like desert half the year, and also that's where Lula came from. So it's a long story, but anyway, they blocked tens of thousands of people from getting to the voting stations on time, and the election was really close. And also Bolsonaro, what did he do? He raised welfare payments by like 30% the month before the elections, in a very cynical attempt to get more poor people to vote for him, which didn't end up working, but is still technically illegal because it was like a temporary hike. He announced they were going to go back down to their normal level the month after the elections. And then, so as that was happening, working through social media, they spread all of this hysteria about how the election had been stolen, and they helped finance through private business supporters and things, busloads of people, fanatics, to come in and camp out in front of the military bases and beg for the military to intervene and hold a military coup. And then a group of special forces officers under Bolsonaro's authorization, set up this plan to assassinate Lula, Vice President-elect Alckmin, and Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who's been the main target of the international right wing now in Brazil for like years. I mean, he's the guy who Trump Truth Social just sued yesterday, right?
Right.
But anyway, they were following them around, and they had meetings in which they were trying to decide if they'd use poison or a bomb or shooting them or whatever. But it was all contingent on getting approval from the chief of the Army and the Air Force. The Navy chief had already agreed to come on board with a military coup. To their credit, the heads of the Army and Air Force refused to go in with it. So they were saying, like, well, if we don't get authorization from the head of the Army by December 15th, we're calling it off. And then their last resort was this Trump-style Capitol invasion. So people looking at this from afar think, oh, it couldn't have been such a big deal. It was just a bunch of protesters storming the Capitol like they did in Washington, D.C. But that was like a last-ditch effort. And it had a systematic plan behind it. The idea was to force Lula to declare a state of siege. If he did that, that would have turned the security of the nation temporarily over to the military. At that point, the military would arrest him, according to their plan. But Lula didn't fall for it. So
we knew a lot. We'd seen all of that play out, but the piece that's coming out in the charges about the discussions and plot to poison Lula and then basically assassinate with a gun that Supreme Court justice. I mean, it's incredibly salacious, but also not shocking, really, I would say, for Bolsonaro. And what it seems like there's discussions right now about him potentially getting amnesty abroad. Hungary with their far-right leader, Viktor Orban, has been discussed, but also the United States, because Bolsonaro's been coming to Miami and chilling over here, and Steve Bannon is good buddies with his son. So with this lawsuit against the Supreme Court justice by Trump that just was launched yesterday, it seems like that's what they're setting up. Is they may try to get Bolsonaro out of the country. Is that something that you think could actually happen?
Well, Bolsonaro's passport has been confiscated by the federal police, so it's illegal for him to leave the country. He begged the Supreme Court for an exception so he could go to the Trump inauguration and maybe sit outside like his wife did. She wasn't even allowed in. But they're saying now, because he is a flight, like he went into the Hungarian embassy at one point. He actually resigned from the presidency and fled to Orlando like 2 weeks before his mandate ended.
Right.
Because he was worried that it might backfire. Their final last-ditch coup effort might backfire. But they're talking about maybe putting like an ankle bracelet on him now, which I think would be kind of funny, and deserve it. But, it's hard to say because, the Trump, obviously there's a coup attempt in the works against Lula, being backed by Elon Musk, Glenn Greenwald, Trump. I mean, Greenwald's been the guy for the last 2 years who's been lying to everybody in the world that this one of 11 Supreme Court ministers, Alexandre de Moraes, who happens to be the one overseeing the investigation against Bolsonaro, is the de facto dictator of Brazil. He's the real ruler. He doesn't have any control over the budget or the military or the police forces or anything, but he's the ruler. That's why I say I think Greenwald would promote the idea of like arresting Alexandre de Moraes or something and overthrowing Lula. But the thing is, like, even the New York Times has been pushing this narrative against Alexandre de Moraes for like almost 2 years. A week before the election, they ran this big critical article about the Supreme Court in Brazil being authoritarian for clamping down on the far right. And they've run like 5 or 6 articles pushing this narrative. When the X-ban happened, they pushed it again. And they're all written by Jack Nickus, who's like former tech reporter from New York Times and Wall Street Journal, covering the Silicon Valley beat. So I just wonder if that's a reason why it seems so sympathetic to this narrative being pushed by Elon Musk and other tech billionaires, or if it's something that the New York Times supports. It has nothing to do with the author, and it's just their position because, the New York Times gave a lot of support to the coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016, and the Democrats and the Republicans are aligned on a lot of issues.
I mean, yeah, right. Venezuela and Mexico too, right? Like that has been the slant of their coverage. They gave a lot of credence to the idea that Guaido, he was actually the true ruler or whatever. So this is nothing new with them. But is this really over for Musk? The fact that Brazil had basically told him. And for a while, Twitter went dark there because they were, it was over disinformation. And Lula said, you're not going to be able to operate here if you don't abide by our rules, essentially. Or is it also wanting access to, say, rare minerals in Brazil is why the tech billionaires are obsessed with this?
Well, there's definitely a lot of minerals in Brazil. But in this specific case, this Michael Schellenberger was busted lying and like patching together a bunch of different emails to make it look like the Supreme Court was trying to persecute staff because they would refuse to take down conservative pundits off the X page. Actually, what it was about was that Nazism is illegal in Brazil, just like it's illegal in Germany and in France. Brazil had the largest Nazi party outside of Germany during the 1930s and has a long fascist tradition of its own. So it's illegal. We have a different concept of speech rights down here, and especially during election season, speech rights are further restricted. For example, it's against the law to run negative campaign ads in Brazil during an election season. The election season is really short. In the case of this X ban, there were underground neo-Nazi cells contacting adolescents on social media and trying to incite them to commit school massacres. And a few school massacres started, and there was such a wave of panic across the country that like 30-40% of the kids' parents were just not letting them go to school. And then it was all planned to have a day of massacres on Hitler's birthday. And so the Ministry of Justice summoned all of the representatives of the foreign social media platforms in Brazil, and X was the only one that didn't want to comply. So they had to push back. X finally agreed to do it, and they managed to arrest a bunch of people. But then there was another case where X was refusing to turn over data on one of the leaders of the PCC, which is the largest organized crime cocaine mafia in Brazil, from his X page or something. And so a local prosecutor in the state of Sao Paulo was threatening to press charges against X if they didn't release the data on that criminal that we're looking for. And so Schellenberger took that email, and then patched it together with some other emails, made it look like it wasn't written by this local prosecutor. He made it look like it was written by Alexandre de Moraes, and they started this thing called the Twitter Files Brazil. And this Schellenberger speaks Portuguese. So he was down here saying, I think everyone should have the right to lie. You should have the right to lie. And he was busted for doing it, and then he just apologized. So I apologize. I'm going back to the U.S. now. Here's my bank details if you want to donate money to my research. And they just took off.
I mean, that is just amazing, but also satisfying that they were, stood up to. But it'll be interesting to see if Donald Trump tries to basically kind of retaliate because of this Bolsonaro
That's
charge.
what we're worried about down here. We're worried, he might threaten sanctions or something. Right. He's going to try and pressure. Because they've turned this guy Alexandre de Moraes into this international boogeyman of the international far right. If you look at the guy, he looks a little bit like Dr. Evil. So like of all the Supreme Court justices, he's the one who looks the most like a Bond villain or something. And so this helps with the memes and everything. But he's just like the face of this authoritarian Supreme Court in Brazil, according to Musk and Trump and everybody now.
Yeah. Right. Apparently it's not authoritarian when you do a hostile takeover of the government as the world's richest man and just start tinkering around with all of our government programs for your own gains. It's authoritarian that the Supreme Court justice may be on the left.
It's also not censorship when you order all government agencies to stop using the word gender.
Yeah.
That's not censorship.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Well, Brian.
It's just when you tell Nazis they can't be Nazis.
Right, exactly.
JD Vance in Europe too. It's not because people are being suppressed for Palestine protests. It's because AFD isn't getting like pride of place.
Exactly. If you're a Zionist, you can't be a Nazi according to these guys. When we all know who the new Nazis are. But well, I really appreciate your time today, Brian. Thanks for keeping us catching us up on what's been happening in Brazil, and good to talk to you.
Thanks. Good to talk to you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.